Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar today on maternity pay in Sage 50 Payroll. My name's Duncan. I'm your host and presenter for this webinar, and I am joined by my colleague Lee, who is standing by in the background, ready and waiting to answer any of your questions. So let's now take a look at what we're going to cover in the webinar. So we'll start with a brief introduction to statutory maternity pay and legislation, and we'll run through the current rates of pay. We're then going to go into some demonstrations showing you how to record maternity details in Sage 50 Payroll. We'll take a look at how that calculates the statutory payment, and then how to adjust your employees' other payments to accommodate the SMP being paid. And then we'll look at the process for reclaiming statutory payments at the end of the month and submitting the employer payment summary with that information. At the end, we're going to share some troubleshooting tips and some common reasons for SMP issues and how to get around those problems. And we will try to stick around to make sure we have answered all of the questions that we have received. So let's get straight on with our introduction. And we'll first start by explaining what SMP is. So SMP is short for statutory maternity pay. It's a payment made by employers to qualifying employees when they take time off work to have a baby. Now, it is payable for up to 39 weeks. And for the first 6 weeks of SMP, it is paid at a higher rate, which is 90% of your employee's average weekly earnings, or AWE. And then for the remaining 33 weeks, it is paid at a standard rate of either £172.48 per week for the current tax year, or 90% of average weekly earnings if that's lower. Now, if the employee doesn't take the full 39 weeks, therefore return to work before that, the entitlement will end at the last full week that they were due. Now, in order to get this payment, they must meet the eligibility criteria. Then you can read more about this on the gov.uk website, but just to summarise, employees must be on your payroll in the qualifying week. So that is the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth. They need to give you the correct notice. They need to provide proof that they're pregnant, which is usually the MAP-B1 certificate. And they need to have been continuously employed by you for at least 26 weeks up to and into the qualifying week. They must also earn at least £123 per week in the 8-week relevant period, and that's the period that leads up to the qualifying week. Now, just to put some of that information into context, we've got a timeline of the key dates, and we're going to work back from the due date, also known as expected week of confinement, or EWC. And if we count back 15 weeks, that takes us to the qualifying week. So 15 weeks before the due date is the qualifying week, and that is the period up to which the average earnings is calculated. Now, to qualify, they must have been working for you at least 26 weeks before the qualifying week. So that's the earliest start date, or the latest start date, I should say. And then the 8-week period where the average weekly earnings are calculated is the 8 weeks leading up to the qualifying week. Earliest leave date for maternity leave is usually 11 weeks before the due date. However, if the baby is born before 11 weeks before the due date, it will start with immediate effect. And for employees that are off sick due to a pregnancy-related sickness, if they are still off sick 4 weeks before the due date, at that point they must transfer and start their SMP payment. So those are some of the key dates, and these will all be worked out by the programme, as you'll see in the demonstration in a few moments. But that's just to put it visually on screen, giving you an idea of where everything sits in relation to that due date. So before we go into the demo, it's worth mentioning at this point that all statutory parental payments, including maternity pay, can be reclaimed by the employer from HMRC. Most employers will reclaim 92% of the statutory payment that they pay out. However, if you qualify for small employers relief, you get 100% of the statutory payment and a further 3% of NI compensation. So it's a total reclaim of 103%. Now, you would usually qualify for this relief if your total Class 1 national insurance contributions, so that's employee plus employer, were £45,000 or less in the tax year before the qualifying or matching week in the case of adoption. Now, the reason we mention this up front is that you will need to make sure that you've set up small employers relief before you process any maternity pay in order to reclaim the correct percentage. Or if you don't qualify for small employers relief, you should check that you're not set up for it. And that way, you know that when it comes to the reclaim, you're going to be getting the correct amount back. So I just want to show you quickly in the program how you can check what your total national insurance contribution was in a previous tax year, and also where to find the small employers relief setting. So just bringing the slides down, and you'll see that I'm signed into Sage 50 Payroll. Now, first thing I want to show you is how to check your total national insurance contributions for a previous tax year. Now, I'm going to check the NICs for the tax year ending the 5th of April 2023. So that's tax year 22 to 23. And to do this, I will first change my process date back to the 5th of April of that previous year. And you can see the tax year just here is showing 22 to 23. And once you've done that, you'll be able to report on that tax year. So I'm going to run the P32 report, and that is going to show me my total national insurance. So if I go into the reports option, and I go to the period end folder here on the left-hand side, I've added it to my favorites. So this is a report you would usually run at the end of the month, but I'm going to run it for the full tax year, ending the 5th of April. So I'm going to do it for month 1 to 12, here in the criteria values. And you'll see that for this report, if I just zoom in slightly for you, for the tax year ending 5th of April 2023, my gross national insurance, that's the employer plus employee contribution, was £37,085.73. So that tells me that in the current tax year, 23 to 24, I would qualify for small employers relief. So to make sure that's set up, I just need to set my process date back to the current date. So my next pay date will be the 30th of November. And then if I go into the company tasks and then into settings, you'll see on the details tab, you've got the eligible for small employers relief box. Now, because I am eligible, I need to make sure that's ticked. So this is a good check to do at the start of a tax year, or at the very least before you process a statutory parental payment. If you weren't eligible for it, you should check that this box is not ticked. So I'm going to save that change, and it means that when we come to reclaim the payment, I will get that small employers percentage, 103%, rather than the standard 92. So there'll be more about reclaiming statutory payments later on in the webinar, but we will now move on and we'll take a look at recording maternity details in your payroll. So when it comes to setting up SMP, there's 2 bits of information that you'll need. So you'll need to know the date that the employee wants to start their maternity leave and their SMP payments. And you will also need their medical evidence, usually the MAP-B1 certificate, which confirms the baby's due date. And once you have that information, it's just a case of recording the maternity details in your software, and then the statutory maternity pay will calculate automatically when you come to process your payroll. So there's a couple of different ways you can enter this information, and I'm going to show you both in the demo. So I'm going to start by entering the information in the quick SMP screen. And this is where all the details are entered in one place. And it's also where you can run a handy report showing the maternity information. Now, to do this, go to your employee tasks and then select the employee who's going on maternity leave. So it just happens to be the first employee in my list. And then if you take a look at the list of tasks, you should find there is one now for recording maternity. And when I go ahead and click on that task, you'll see it opens the Quick SMP screen. Now from here, you just need to select a box to say you've received the medical evidence. And from that evidence, you'll have the expected date of birth, which in this example is the 25th of November. You can then click Check Entitlement, and Payroll will run some checks to make sure that the qualifying conditions have been met. And then you can go ahead and you can enter the employee's last day of work so that the SMP entitlement begins the following day. Now, in this example, the employee is working up until the 10th of November. So that's what I'll enter as the last day of work. And that means that the maternity pay will start from the 11th of November, and it'll run through for up to 39 weeks, which would take them all the way up to the 9th of August. If you have a look at these key dates on the right-hand side, which will be the last day of the maternity pay period, assuming they're taking the full 39 weeks. So as you can see here, there's been some checks to make sure the evidence is received. So we've ticked the box. The employee has worked for long enough, so that 26 weeks before the qualifying week, and it's checked the average earnings to make sure they're above £123. It displays the calculated average earnings, so average weekly pay for this employee, 461.54, and then it lists the key dates. So a few to point out here is the qualifying week, 15th week before the baby is due, was the 6th of August. They need to have been employed on the 18th of February at the latest for their start date to meet the length of service qualification. Earliest date leave can start, it's 11 weeks before the due date. Last day of work we've already entered, and last day of maternity pay period is 39 weeks later. Now you'll also see you've got the entitlement shown in the table at the bottom. So this is where you get 6 weeks at the higher rate, which in my case is 90% of the average earnings, followed by 33 weeks at the standard rate. For this tax year, £172.48. Now, if the maternity leave extends into the next tax year, the new rate of SMP will kick in for all periods within that new tax year. So it will increase from the 6th of April to next year's standard rate. So a couple of other things just to point out is that if you need to record special circumstances relating to the pregnancy, you can do so from here. So this would include any weeks on trade dispute, if maternity pay was started early due to sickness, 4 weeks before the due date, or if it was started early due to birth, more than 11 weeks before the due date. So you don't often need to use these settings, and you can override the calculated average where required by overtyping this figure just here. Now you will notice that I haven't filled in the actual date of birth or the return to work date at this point. So if you know that at the point you're setting it up, you could enter it, but you can leave it blank because often you won't know the actual date of birth when you set this up. And you can save the details by clicking save. And then if you click the print option, you'll be able to print a summary of this information. So I'll show you what that summary looks like. This is the SMP details report. So it just shows that the qualifying conditions were met, it displays the average earnings, it lists all of those key dates, and it shows the statutory entitlement. So that might be handy for your own payroll records in relation to the maternity leave. So I'm just going to close out of this screen now, and those are the maternity details entered. The alternative to using recording maternity is to enter the details directly in the employee record. So I will just show you where that is, because you might have done this if you've processed in the past. So you can go to the absence tab in the employee record, and then under further information, you would click SMP. So this is where you'd enter the due date. You would need to click auto calc to calculate the average weekly gross. Put your ended work date in just here. and tick medical evidence received. And then you can check the calculation of the average earnings, and you can view the entitlement information from the entitlement tab. So just an alternative way of entering the details if you prefer to enter them directly in the employee record. So now that the details are entered, if I return to my payroll tasks and set my process date to my next pay date, which I've already done, so 30th of November, I can go into the enter payment screen for this particular employee, and to check the SMP amount, just need to go to the summary tab, and you'll see that there's now amount alongside statutory maternity pay. So this is calculated from the start of the SMP up until the process date, which in my case is the last day of the month. If you want to see a breakdown of this total amount, you can click on it. You can click the drop-down arrow. That then takes you into the SMP details in the employee record. And if you click the entitlement tab here at the top, you can see that currently due is 2.86 weeks. So that's the amount of time between start of maternity period and our current process date. And you can also see that full entitlement shown at the bottom of the screen here. So this is where you would come if you're troubleshooting SMP amounts, but there'll be more on that later on in the webinar. So the details are entered, the statutory payment is calculating automatically. We are going to come back and adjust the basic pay in just a moment, but let's just recap where we're up to at this point. So first thing we did is we entered the maternity details, and if you use the recording maternity option from the employee tasks, you can enter everything in one page and you can print that report showing all of the key information. Once that's entered, we went into the enter payment screen where we could check the statutory maternity pay amount, and to get a breakdown of that amount, we drilled down, selected the entitlement tab, and we could see what was currently due. So that takes care of the statutory element of the pay. Next thing you would consider is how you're going to adjust your employees' other payments. Now, the way that you do this very much depends on the contract of employment you have with your employee and whether or not you as a company have a company maternity pay scheme. So you might provide more than the statutory amount for at least part of the maternity leave. And if so, you would pay them their usual basic, made up of statutory pay and basic pay. Or you might not have a company maternity scheme, in which case you would only want to pay them the statutory pay for the period they're off. So let's take a look at how you would adjust your payments. I'm just going to return to the demo at this point. So let's go back into the enter payment screen for this employee. And as it stands, I've got their full salary entered. So they usually get £2,000 per month. And when I click onto the summary tab, we can see the maternity pay from the 11th of November up to my pay date has been calculated automatically. Now, if I have a company scheme and I want them to receive £2,000, their full basic pay this month, I can use the make up basic option to do an automatic adjustment. So you can see this at the bottom of the screen here. And first thing to do is to enter the full amount you want them to receive in the usual place. So I've got their full salary of £2,000 entered on the payments tab. And then if I click the summary tab and then click make up basic here at the bottom, it'll alert you that you've selected to make up basic for this employee and that the hours or number value of salary in this case will need to be reduced. Now, because that is the payment I want to adjust, I'm going to click yes to continue. And you'll see that straight away, the total gross pay for this employee has reduced to £2,000. And it's done that by adjusting the hours or number value, thereby reducing the amount of salary. And when that's added to the statutory pay, the employee gets their usual basic. And you can continue to do that for any period where there's a specific amount you want them to receive in total. So in this case, it's the full pay for the month. But if there's another amount you want to make up to, you could enter that amount and then make up to that using Makeup Basic. Now, if you don't have a company maternity scheme, you'll need to do a manual calculation to work out how much to pay them for the days or hours they've worked this period. And then the statutory maternity pay will calculate automatically. So in this particular example, let's say I only want to pay them for the days worked in November. Now, I know that this employee worked for 8 days up until their leave date, and there are 22 working days in November for this particular employee. So what I might do to do a manual adjustment is to do 8 divided by 22 as the hours value, which will then reduce the salary to reflect the number of days I want to pay them for. Now, you would use whichever method you would usually use as a company. So think if you take on a new starter that doesn't work for a full period, or you have a leaver that doesn't work for a full month, how would you usually adjust their pay? And you would apply the same principle if you wanted to reduce the salary when someone goes on parental leave. Now, next month, because they'll be on leave for the full month, we can simply reduce the salary to 0, but the statutory amount will continue to calculate automatically. So a couple of different ways of adjusting payments depending on whether there is an amount specifically that you want to make up to. The other thing I want to mention, especially if you don't have a company scheme, is pension contributions. So usually, while an employee is on maternity leave, you are required to maintain the usual pension contribution as the employer based on their usual salary. But this will all depend on the pension scheme rules. And if you're in any doubt, you should always clarify this with your pension provider. Now, if you're reducing the employee's usual pay because they're on maternity leave, you might need to override the calculated percentage and replace that with a fixed amount of the amount you want to contribute. So I just want to show you where you can do that. So to make changes to the pension contribution, you can go into the employee record. So we can use this shortcut and enter payments to do that. We can go to the pensions tab, can click manage schemes and edit the pension scheme. And then in this case, it's just the employer contribution that I want to override. So I'm going to change it to a fixed amount, and I will enter the amount that I usually contribute to this employee's pension. So we can't tell you whether or not your pension scheme works in that way. It is usually the case. So if you're in any doubt, speak to your pension provider and ask them what needs to happen during periods of maternity leave. So by setting that to a fixed amount, that has now overridden the pension. You can see we usually chip in £44.40. And if I check the employer's information now, it is showing that as the current pension. So once you've made the necessary adjustments, you would then continue with your payroll in the usual way. So I just want to show you some of the pre-update reports. So we'll take a look at the payslip first. And you can see on this particular payslip, it's the first employee in my list. We've got the salary that we adjusted. So we adjusted this due to the employee started their leave. You've got the statutory payment, which will show parental pay, which is calculated by the system. And then we've got the usual deductions for tax, national insurance, pension, and all of the year-to-date values. So statutory payments will always have their own separate line. You can also see them on payment summary reports. So if I run payment summary part 1, you'll see that there is a column for parental payments just here. So statutory payment for this employee is itemized in this particular column. So once you've got your pay slips and reports, you would then update the records in the usual way. And you would send your FPS to HMRC, and that will report the usual information, so payments and deductions, tax, national insurance, and student loans, and it will calculate the total liability based on those deductions. But because we're reclaiming some statutory pay, we are going to do another submission at the end of the month, because this isn't the total amount we're going to pay. We're actually going to pay less due to the amounts that we have reclaimed. So I've sent my full payment submission. That's the pay run complete. Well, let's just recap that information on adjusting payments. So one way to do it is using Make Up Basic. If there's a specific amount that you want to make up to, for example, full basic pay. So enter the full pay, come to the summary tab and click Make Up Basic. Or you'll do a manual adjustment. So work out exactly what you want to pay them for the days or hours worked, and then enter that against your salary or basic pay line. Quick word on pension adjustments. Employer pension contributions during SMP are usually based on an employee's normal pay. So you may need to enter a fixed amount contribution to override the calculated percentage. Do seek clarification from your pension provider or HMRC if required. So now that we've completed our pay run, we can start thinking about reclaiming that statutory payment. So you saw when we submitted the FPS, it submitted the full information, all of the tax and the national insurance and the liability based on those values. But in reality, because we're reclaiming a statutory payment, we are going to end up paying less than the amount submitted in our FPS. And for that reason, we do need to submit an EPS no later than the 19th of the following calendar month. So the P32 report will itemize how much you can recover. And if you've set up small employers relief, it will include that NIC compensation. And then it's the EPS submission. It's a monthly submission, even if you pay weekly. So wait until the end of the tax month before you send this, and then you can submit your adjustments. So let's take a quick look at that process now. So I've completed my payroll for tax month 8. I've submitted my FPS. Now ready to calculate the amount I need to pay. So I can either go into reports and I can run my P32 report, which I've added to my favorites, but you would find it in the period end folder. You can also find this report from your payroll links. So we're going to run it for tax month 8. And if we take a look at this report, you can see it's got my total income tax, gross national insurance, so everything that was included in my FPS. But we've then got our SMP recovered. So I've recovered 100% of what was paid out, and I got that further 3% NI compensation as a small employer. So when it comes to actually making the payment, I'm not paying that 5 and a bit thousand that was in my FPS. I'm actually paying just over £4,000. And because there is an adjustment to report, I do need to submit an EPS to HMRC. So you do this at the end of each month. It will submit the cumulative values for the tax year. So if you forgot to do this at a previous month, all you need to do is to send an EPS at the end of your next month, your current month. And when you're ready to make the submissions, you just go to the e-submissions tasks, and then you'll find from here, employer payment summary. So you need to complete the wizard explaining why you're sending this. So in this case, we're adjusting a payment as we've recovered statutory pay. It shows the tax month the submission relates to, and it shows the values for the tax year that have been reclaimed. So this is the first time this tax year that I've reclaimed a statutory parental payment. But when I go through this at the end of next month, you'll find that it's the cumulative value for the amounts recovered. So there's then a section for CIS deductions suffered. If that applies to you, you can enter the amount there. And apprenticeship levy payments for those larger businesses that pay that. We complete the wizard. You can ignore the warning. This is just because I'm in the training room. And then it takes us to the submission screen. So you can check your details. These are all saved in your e-submission settings. You can then click the submit option. And once that submission has been made, you've then sent the information about the reduction in your liability so that when you make the payment, HMRC will know that you've paid the correct amount. And if you ever need to look back on the values that you've previously submitted from the e-submission tasks, you can always go into your e-submissions log. And if you find your latest submission at the bottom of the list, so this one's an EPS, you can check the details. And if you click more details, you can see what values were sent in that submission. So that is reclaiming the statutory payment. I just need to pay the amount that was due, and that should all reconcile back to what was submitted to HMRC. So we've covered setting up and processing SMP and then reclaiming the payment at the end of the month. But I want to spend 10 minutes just to finish the webinar on some troubleshooting tips. So we've picked out some of the more common problems that people come across when dealing with SMP. And I would say that approximately 20% of all of the contacts that we have about this is in relation to employees that have received SMP in the past, and you're trying to set it up for another child. Now, the reason that the problem comes about is that payroll always stores the number of weeks paid of SMP, and that applies even when you move into a new tax year, because SMP can quite often span multiple tax years. And it means when you come to set it up again, if that value isn't cleared, the amounts for the new child, the second child, third child, whatever it might be, don't calculate. So there's a couple of ways you can avoid this problem or work around this problem, as I will show you in a quick demo. So if I return to my payroll tasks, I'm just going to set my process date to next month's pay date, which will be the end of the year. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to select an employee who is starting maternity leave, but I do know that they've had maternity leave in the past. And when I click on the recording maternity link or the recording maternity task, which you find from the employee tasks, you'll see a message pops up prompting you that you've already paid SMP to the employee and you want to record details for a second child. Now, when you see this message, you should always be a bit careful, because if you're in the middle of paying SMP, you're not setting it up for a second child, you would need to click no to view the current SMP details. And if I do that, you'll see that the details entered actually relate to about 6 years ago now, 2017-18, when the employee was last on her maternity leave. Now, because I'm setting it up for a new employee, I can click yes, and that will clear out the information. But if I decide to enter the details a different way, if I go into the employee record, into the absence tab, and then into SMP, this is where you can sometimes come across a problem. So I can see there's already information here, but all I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it with information for a new child. So I'll put the due date on, we'll put the ended work date, we'll recalculate the average wage, and we will click OK. So I've replaced the details here. But the problem is, when I try to process the payment and check the SMP amount, is nothing is calculating. And if you're troubleshooting, do the drill down and click entitlement. And what it will indicate here is that 39 weeks have already been paid. Now, we know that that was from a previous child, and I can't just delete this figure from here. It's actually stored in the year-to-date values. So one way to work around this would be to go into the employee record, onto the employment tab, and then into year-to-date values. And from statutory payments, you can simply reset the weeks paid to 0. So that's one way you could get around it. However, if you were recording the details using this link, Recording Maternity, you know that you're setting that up for a second child. You're not just viewing current details. You can click yes. You can just pop those dates back in, exactly how I did before. And what this will do is it will automatically clear the previous paid weeks. And you can see that our statutory maternity pay is now calculating. So second children, if they've had SMP before, you can sometimes come across this issue. You can often avoid it by using Recording Maternity, but use that with caution. So employee 1, who is currently receiving maternity, if I did the same thing for them, I don't want to clear it. I want to click no to view the current details. So if in doubt, click no. And then if you realize, yeah, actually, I want to set this up again, you go back in and click yes. So I thought I'd highlight that one, because as I say, that is quite a common one. Some other reasons why SMP might not calculate would be if the average earnings are too low. So remember, you can check the average earnings figure either in the quick SMP screen or by clicking Auto Calc if you're entering the details directly in the employee record. So you need to be £123 or more to qualify for the payment. And a third reason why no SMP might calculate is that you've got it set to manual statutory pay calculations. So there are some reasons where you might use manual statutory pay. Sometimes if you're continuing SMP after using another system, for example, or you've transferred to a new PAYE reference. But if you want it to calculate automatically and you've got that box ticked, I'll just show you where that box is. It's employee 7's got it ticked, I think. On the absence tab under SMP, it's this box at the bottom. If you've got this ticked, even if you enter the baby arrival dates, nothing will calculate automatically. Effectively, that'll be for information, and it would be wanting you to enter an amount of SMP yourself, which you might do if you've worked it out a different way, maybe using HMRC's calculator. But just be aware that that's a setting. If you've got it ticked and you try to use Recording Maternity, it will tell you, and it will give you the option to clear that box. So you can then set it up to calculate automatically in the way we've already shown you. So other reasons there why it might not calculate. Just going to finish with troubleshooting SMP amounts being less or sometimes more than expected. So first thing to check is, have you entered the correct process date? So if you're setting this up before doing the pay run, maybe you've logged in with today's date and it's only calculating the SMP up to today instead of up to your pay date. So the solution is to make sure the correct process date is entered. Be aware that statutory pay is calculated up to your process date. So if that isn't the end of the period you're paying up to, so maybe you pay on the 25th for work done up to the end of the month, you would find that your first SMP payment is slightly lower than expected, but the last SMP payment will be higher because it'll be making up for those days between the pay date and the end of the period. So check you've got the correct process date entered. If you have, be aware that statutory pay is calculated up to that date. And if it's just the higher rate that you're querying, sorry, the standard rate that you're querying, if that seems lower than the standard rate of SMP, it could be because 90% of average weekly earnings is below the standard 172.48. And in that case, it's correct because the standard rate is the lower of 90% average earnings or the standard rate for the tax year. So some troubleshooting tips there, which then bring us to the end of the webinar. We will stick around for a few more moments just to make sure that we've answered as many questions as possible. Before we do that, I'll just run through some further support that's available to you all. So our help centre is always available at sage.co.uk/help. Just follow the links for Sage 50 Payroll, or click any of the help options that you would find within your programme itself. From here, you'll be able to search our knowledge base by entering error messages or keywords. You'll be able to read support guides, So we have them on absences and statutory payments. You'll be able to see what other webinars are coming up by clicking the webinars link towards the top of the Help Centre. And from there, you'll also find recent recordings. If you need to get in touch with our support team, you'll find all of their contact details on the Help Centre as well. So it's at sage.co.uk/help or by clicking any help icon in Sage 50 Payroll. As a Sage member, you also have free access to Sage University at sageu.com. All you need to do is to register and create a profile. And from there, you can complete our e-learning courses. You can do online certification, and there's a range of bite-sized payroll learning that you can use to brush up on your payroll skills. So a really useful resource if you're new, or even if you're not new to Sage 50 Payroll. There's always something out there to learn. So we are going to focus on getting those questions answered. We're going to do that in the chat panel. So look out for questions and answers appearing there. I'm going to go on to mute just to help out with answering some of those questions. And I will come back once we've got the final answers submitted. If anyone is leaving now, thanks so much for joining us at the webinar today. We will send you a follow-up email later today with a link to the recording. And if you wouldn't mind spending a moment just completing our survey, that would be very much appreciated. So we will stick around for a short amount of time just to answer those questions. And when we're ready to close down, I'll be back to say goodbye. So I shall speak to you shortly. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for sending through your questions. You've certainly kept us busy this afternoon, and I hope that the answers that we've sent back are useful. We're just finishing off the last ones there as I speak, so I just want to take this opportunity to thank those of you that have stuck around to the very end for joining me at the webinar today. You may well see an exit survey as you leave, and we'd really love to see any feedback that you might have on today's session, as it will help us to improve these things moving forward. And do look out for a follow-up email, which will be arriving later today. That will contain a link to our webinar landing page where you can sign up for further sessions, and also a link to watch the recording of today's webinar. So do look out for that in your inbox, arriving later this afternoon. So I think that's the last question answered, and we are slightly over time, so apologies for that. We are running other paternity or parental payment sessions next week, so do join us on those ones if you want to learn more about paternity or shared parental. You can sign up at sage.co.uk/webinars. But for today, that's all we've got time for. Thanks once again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you on some of our other webinars in the future. So goodbye for now.